Rain fell in thin gray sheets over Manhattan the morning. A man in a worn coat walked into the marble lobby of a corporation worth tens of billions of dollars. The woman behind the reception desk barely looked up. The security guards exchanged a glance and said nothing. Then the chief executive officer herself stepped out of her private elevator, saw him standing there dripping onto her polished floor, and looked him up and down with open disdain. "The charity distribution center is across the street," she said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. Laughter rippled through the room. The man only smiled, signed his name quietly in the visitor's log, and walked back out into the rain. 2 hours later, every executive in that building would stand frozen in silence as a lawyer read aloud the name of the true owner of the company. The man she had just called a beggar was the one person alive who held the fate of her family's empire in his hands. Daniel Carter had taken the subway that morning, the way he took it every morning, and then walked 6 blocks through the drizzle because he preferred walking to waiting for a cab. His coat was plain, gray, bought years earlier and never replaced because it still kept him warm. His shoes were scuffed at the toes. He carried no briefcase, no umbrella, nothing that announced wealth or importance, because Daniel Carter had spent the better part of 2 decades making sure nothing about him announced anything at all. Around him, the city moved the way it always moved on rainy mornings, taxis splashing through the gutters, commuters ducking under awnings, 1,000 strangers passing each other without a single glance exchanged, and Daniel had always found something comforting in that anonymity. A kind of peace he had never once felt inside a boardroom. He crossed the street toward the glass tower that bore his grandfather's name carved into granite above the entrance. And for a moment he simply stood there, looking up at the letters, remembering a boy who used to sit on his grandfather's knee in that very lobby 50 years earlier, back when the building had been half its current height, and the old man had known every employee by name. The memory surfaced easily, the smell of his grandfather's pipe tobacco, the sound of his laughter, echoing off marble that had since been replaced twice over, and Daniel allowed himself only a moment with it before pushing forward through the revolving door. The security guard at the front desk watched him approach and immediately assumed he had wandered in looking for work or shelter from the storm outside. "Sir, employment applications are handled 2 blocks down," the guard said, not unkindly, already gesturing toward the door. "I'm here for the shareholders' meeting," Daniel replied evenly. "Which floor, please?" The guard hesitated, unsure whether to laugh or call for backup, and it was in that exact moment that Victoria Langford stepped out of her chauffeured car at the curb, moving through the revolving door in a tailored charcoal suit that had cost more than most people's monthly salary. She was 36 years old, brilliant, relentless, and utterly convinced that she was the only person capable of saving Carter Holdings from the chaos that had followed the founder's death. She had built her entire identity around competence, around being underestimated as a young woman in finance and then proving every doubter wrong through sheer force of will. She scanned the lobby out of habit, cataloging everyone in it, and her eyes landed on Daniel, standing dripping near the guard's desk. She saw the coat. She saw the shoes. She did not see the man. "If you need money for a meal, the front desk can direct you to the Shelter Partnership 2 blocks over," Victoria said, her voice carrying easily across the marble atrium, cool and clipped, the kind of voice used to being obeyed instantly. A few junior associates nearby laughed under their breath, quick to align themselves with the woman who controlled their careers. Daniel turned toward her slowly. There was no anger in his face, no wounded pride, nothing that gave away the storm of memory her words had stirred in him. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at weather he has already decided not to let ruin his day. "Thank you," he said quietly. And then he turned and walked back out through the revolving door, into the rain, leaving behind a lobby full of people who had no idea what they had just done. Victoria did not think of him again for nearly an hour. She strode into her office on the 40th floor, dropped her bag on her desk, and began preparing for the board meeting that would determine whether Carter Holdings survived the power vacuum left by its founder's death 6 months earlier. She had no idea that the man she'd humiliated in the lobby was the very person the entire board had been waiting for. The general counsel of Carter Holdings, a soft-spoken attorney named Marcus Whitfield, arrived at the boardroom precisely at 9 and found the room already half full of tension. He set his leather folder on the long walnut table and cleared his throat. "We'll need to delay the vote," Marcus announced. "We're still waiting on the controlling shareholder." Victoria frowned from her seat at the head of the table. "Which shareholder?" "I reviewed the cap table myself last week. There's no single holder above 8%. There is one holding that isn't listed under a public name," Marcus said carefully. "It's held through a family trust established by the founder. Until that party arrives and confirms his position, this board cannot legally proceed with any vote regarding leadership or restructuring." Victoria's jaw tightened. She assumed, as she often did, that this was some kind of maneuver by a rival faction to slow her momentum. Perhaps engineered by the ambitious chief financial officer, Howard Blake, who had made no secret of his own ambitions for her chair. Howard sat 2 seats down, tapping his pen against a legal pad, watching Victoria with an expression that mixed sympathy and calculation in equal measure. Richard Langford, Victoria's father and the company's honorary chairman, sat at the far end of the table looking older than his years. His hands folded tightly in his lap, saying nothing, though anyone paying close attention would have noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. While the boardroom sat in uneasy limbo, Daniel found a small coffee shop 2 blocks away and settled into a corner booth. Water still beaded on his shoulders. He ordered black coffee and pulled a worn manila envelope from inside his coat, an envelope he had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Inside was a copy of his grandfather's final letter, written not as a legal document, but as a private confession from an old man to his only grandson. Daniel remembered sitting across from his grandfather in a hospital room years earlier, listening to the old man's raspy voice explain that he had built Carter Holdings from a single textile warehouse in Queens into an empire spanning finance, logistics, and manufacturing, and that he had always hoped Daniel would carry it forward. Daniel had refused. He remembered the conversation as if it had happened yesterday. Remembered telling his grandfather that he wanted a quiet life, a family, an ordinary rhythm of days that didn't revolve around boardrooms and quarterly earnings calls. His grandfather had listened without arguing, had simply nodded, and told him that a man should never be handed a crown he didn't ask for, and that the trust would wait, untouched, for however many years it took, even if that meant it waited for a generation Daniel himself hadn't yet raised. That promise had settled quietly into the family's paperwork and been all but forgotten by everyone except the 2 men who made it. That choice had felt right until the day his wife died, leaving him alone to raise their daughter. And in the years since, he had built something smaller but no less real. A life stripped of pretense, measured in mornings at the coffee shop and evenings spent reading, a life where nobody looked at him twice, because nobody needed to. He had worked ordinary jobs, under an ordinary version of his own name, had coached his daughter's soccer team on Saturday mornings, had learned to cook simple meals from a paperback cookbook with a cracked spine, and had discovered, somewhere in those unremarkable years, that contentment rarely announced itself with anything as loud as wealth. His daughter had since grown and moved abroad for her studies, and the apartment he lived in was quiet now, but he had never once regretted stepping away from the empire that bore his name. He had simply never expected the empire to come looking for him again. His phone buzzed against the table. Marcus's voice was apologetic on the other end. "Mr. Carter, I'm terribly sorry for the delay. Everyone has arrived. The board is ready whenever you are." Daniel folded the letter back into his coat, left cash on the table for his coffee, and walked back out into the rain toward the tower he had once sworn he would never enter as anything more than a visitor. When Daniel walked into the 40th floor boardroom for the second time that day, the room did something Victoria had never seen it do before. Every person in it rose to their feet. She thought, for one absurd second, that he had wandered in by mistake, perhaps looking for a restroom or an exit, and she nearly said something to redirect him before Marcus stepped forward with unmistakable formality. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, "allow me to properly introduce Mr. Daniel Carter." Victoria felt the floor tilt beneath her. Howard's pen stopped moving entirely, his knuckles whitening around it. Richard Langford, at the far end of the table, went pale as paper, his eyes fixed on Daniel, with an expression that mixed dread and something close to grief. Marcus opened a leather folder and began reading from a document that made the room grow so quiet the rain against the windows sounded like static. "Mr. Carter is the grandson of our founder and the sole holder of the family trust established 22 years ago. That trust controls 52% of all voting shares in this company. Per the founder's final instructions, Mr. Carter also retains the authority to appoint or remove the chief executive officer at his discretion, along with veto power over any board resolution." Victoria stared at the man in the plain gray coat, the man she had told to go find a shelter 2 blocks away, and understood in a single sickening instant exactly what she had done. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Howard's expression had shifted from shock to something calculating, already searching for an angle. Richard lowered his head, unable to meet his own daughter's eyes. Daniel took his seat at the head of the table, the seat that had technically always been his to claim, and folded his hands in front of him, with the same calm he'd shown in the lobby. He looked directly at Victoria, and though his tone carried no cruelty, every word landed like a verdict. "I haven't yet decided whether you'll remain chief executive officer of this company," he said. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Victoria to hear her own heartbeat. In the days that followed, Victoria tried repeatedly to apologize, catching Daniel in hallways, requesting private meetings, sending carefully worded messages that she rewrote a dozen times before sending. She found herself, for the first time in years, unable to predict how another person would react to her. And that unpredictability unsettled her more than any hostile takeover attempt ever had. She had built her career on reading a room instantly, on knowing exactly which words would land and which would fail, and Daniel's calm refused to give her anything to read at all. Daniel accepted each apology with the same, even courtesy he showed everyone. But he never dwelled on the insult itself, never once brought up the lobby or the shelter comment in any conversation that followed. What troubled him wasn't wounded pride. It was something deeper, something that had settled into his chest like a stone the moment Victoria's words left her mouth. The realization that the woman entrusted with his grandfather's legacy had built her judgment of human worth entirely on the surface of things, on coats and shoes, and the confidence of a stranger's posture. He thought often, in the quiet of his apartment at night, about how many other people in that lobby, people without his last name and his hidden fortune, must have been dismissed by voices just as certain as hers, and never given the chance to prove otherwise. Daniel requested a full operational audit of the company, every division, every account, every executive decision made in the 6 months since his grandfather's death. Howard Blake grew visibly uneasy the moment the request was announced in a board memo, offering to personally oversee the audit himself. An offer Daniel politely declined in favor of an independent accounting firm he selected without consulting anyone. Auditors descended on the finance department within the week, combing through ledgers that hadn't been touched by outside eyes in years. Strange patterns began surfacing almost immediately. Vendor contracts routed through shell companies, consulting fees paid to entities with no verifiable offices, wire transfers that looped through 3 jurisdictions before landing in accounts nobody in the finance department could explain. Victoria, still reeling from the revelation of who Daniel truly was, remained convinced that she understood the company better than anyone, that whatever irregularities existed were simple accounting noise from the transition period. She continued running board meetings with her usual precision, unaware that the ground beneath her authority had already begun to crack. Daniel said little during this period, watching, reading every report the auditors sent him late into the night in his small apartment, piecing together a picture that grew darker with each new page. Then the number arrived. A single figure, buried 3 layers deep in a subsidiary's quarterly filing, revealed that more than $400 million had quietly vanished from Carter Holdings over the previous 18 months, funneled through contracts that existed only on paper. Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table that night, the figure glowing on his laptop screen, and understood that the crisis facing his grandfather's company was far larger than a boardroom power struggle. Someone inside Carter Holdings had been bleeding it dry in plain sight. And whoever it was had been counting on nobody paying close enough attention to notice. Daniel began his own quiet investigation, working largely alone, trusting almost no one inside the building with what he'd found. He met with the independent auditors in a rented conference room 3 blocks from headquarters, rather than anywhere inside the tower itself, aware that whoever was responsible for the missing money likely had eyes and ears throughout the company. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged that pointed unmistakably toward Howard Blake, whose fingerprints appeared on nearly every questionable contract, whose personal accounts showed deposits that matched suspiciously well with the timing of the missing funds, and whose closest business relationships traced back to a rival conglomerate that had spent years trying to acquire pieces of Carter Holdings at a discount. Richard Langford, it turned out, had known far more than he'd ever admitted. Years earlier, during a period of declining health and diminished attention, Richard had signed off on several of Howard's early proposals without fully understanding their long-term implications, and Howard had spent every year since quietly expanding his leverage over the aging chairman, using Richard's fear of losing his own reputation to keep him silent. Richard had told himself, each time he looked away from another questionable transaction, that he was protecting the family name rather than betraying it. That silence was simply the price of dignity in a world that had already begun to move past him. It was a lie he had grown skilled at telling himself, though it never once let him sleep easily. Victoria had never been told any of this. Her father had shielded her from the truth out of a misguided sense of protection, believing he could contain the damage himself before it ever touched his daughter's career. Howard, sensing the walls beginning to close around him, moved first. He began quietly circulating a narrative among nervous board members and mid-level executives, suggesting that Daniel Carter's claim to the company was merely symbolic, a paper trust with no real operational authority, and that the entire audit was an overreach by an outsider who understood nothing about running a modern corporation. He was careful with his words, choosing each one for maximum effect, planting doubt over dinners and private phone calls, rather than in any setting where his claims might be directly challenged. Several directors, uncertain and eager to protect their own positions, began to waver. And Howard cultivated their fear the way a gardener cultivates weeds, patiently, deliberately, always careful to leave no fingerprints of his own. Daniel heard the whispers through Marcus and through a handful of loyal employees who still remembered his grandfather fondly, but he said nothing publicly, choosing instead to let Howard's confidence grow just large enough to expose itself fully. He understood something Howard never quite grasped: that a man who has to convince a room he belongs in it has usually already lost the argument, and that patience, properly used, could accomplish what confrontation never would. Howard began preparing for the company's upcoming shareholder meeting with the quiet urgency of a man building a case for a coup, gathering signatures, promising favors, positioning himself to call for a vote that would strip Daniel of any practical influence over daily operations, regardless of what the trust documents technically said. He met privately with representatives from the rival conglomerate late into the evenings, sketching out terms for what he believed would become his own ascension to power. Never once suspecting that every meeting, every signature, every promise was quietly being documented by people who had grown tired of his ambition long before Daniel ever arrived. The shareholder meeting arrived on a gray Thursday morning, the largest gathering the company had held in years, filling the main auditorium on the second floor with investors, executives, and members of the press who had caught wind that something unusual was unfolding inside Carter Holdings. Howard stood near the podium before the meeting officially began, shaking hands, exchanging quiet words with directors he had spent weeks courting, radiating the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Victoria sat near the front, caught between two forces she no longer fully trusted. She had spent the previous weeks watching Howard maneuver with an intensity that unsettled her, watching Daniel remain calm in a way that increasingly struck her not as weakness, but as patience, and for the first time in her career she found herself uncertain which instincts to follow. She had built her entire professional identity on trusting her own judgment above all else, and now that judgment felt like sand slipping through her fingers. She thought of the lobby, of the coat, of the certainty in her own voice that morning, and wondered how many other certainties she had carried through her career without ever once stopping to examine them. Around her, the auditorium buzzed with the particular restlessness of people who sensed a turning point, but couldn't yet name it. Reporters near the back exchanged notes. Junior analysts whispered predictions to one another about which way the vote would fall. Somewhere in that noise, Victoria realized she had spent so many years being the loudest voice in every room that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply wait and watch, the way Daniel seemed to do so naturally. Howard opened the meeting by calling for an immediate vote on operational restructuring, framing it as a necessary modernization that would remove what he called legacy obstacles to efficient decision-making, a phrase everyone in the room understood to mean Daniel. Murmurs spread through the audience. Several directors nodded along, having already been promised seats on a reorganized executive committee. Daniel rose from his seat, unhurried, and walked to the podium without raising his voice. He placed a single folder in front of him. "Before anyone votes," Daniel said, "I'd like to show you what's actually been happening to this company's money." Over the next 20 minutes, Daniel laid out everything the independent auditors had uncovered: falsified vendor contracts, shell company transfers, email correspondence between Howard and executives at a rival firm discussing terms for a hostile position inside Carter Holdings, and bank records showing personal deposits that lined up precisely with the timing of each missing transaction. He called forward 2 employees from the finance department who had agreed to speak on record, their voices shaking but steady, confirming documents they had been quietly asked to alter over the previous year. Howard's composure cracked in real time, his face shifting from confidence to disbelief, to something close to panic as murmurs turned into open gasps across the auditorium. He tried to interrupt, tried to dismiss the documents as incomplete or misleading, but the room had already turned against him, directors who had pledged their support an hour earlier, now leaning away from him as if his very presence had become contagious. Sensing the tide had fully turned, Howard reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder of his own, his hands trembling with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Before anyone believes a word of this," Howard announced, his voice cracking, "I have proof that Daniel Carter's claim to this trust is fraudulent, and that he has no legitimate right to sit in this room at all." A wave of stunned silence swept through the auditorium as Howard held the folder aloft like a weapon. And even Victoria, who had begun to trust Daniel's calm more than she trusted Howard's certainty, felt a flicker of doubt return. Marcus Whitfield stepped forward from the side of the stage, unbothered by Howard's accusation, and set a sealed envelope on the podium beside Daniel, with the deliberate care of a man who had been waiting years for this exact moment. He explained, calmly and clearly, that this envelope contained the founder's final and legally binding testament, notarized and sealed 11 years earlier, held in escrow specifically for a moment, such as this one, should anyone ever challenge the legitimacy of Daniel's inheritance. The envelope was opened before the entire room. Inside was a handwritten letter in the founder's own script, alongside a formal notarized document confirming every detail Marcus had already stated. The letter itself, however, was what silenced the auditorium completely. In it, the founder explained that he had chosen Daniel specifically because Daniel had never wanted the company for its wealth or its power, and that a man who walks away from an empire out of love rather than obligation is precisely the kind of man who should be trusted to protect it when the time comes. The founder wrote that he had watched Howard's ambition grow for years with quiet concern, and had structured the trust deliberately to prevent exactly the kind of takeover Howard had just attempted. Richard Langford, sitting in the front row, began to weep openly, his shoulders shaking as decades of guilt finally broke loose. He rose unsteadily to his feet and, in front of the entire shareholder body, admitted that he had known about several of Howard's early manipulations and had said nothing, believing he could manage the damage privately rather than risk the company's reputation and his own. He turned to Daniel and apologized for having opposed his involvement years earlier, admitting that his own fear of losing relevance had blinded him to who was actually protecting the company's future. Victoria sat frozen through all of it, watching her father's confession, watching Howard escorted quietly from the auditorium by building security as murmurs of shock followed him out, and understood for the first time the full shape of what had been happening around her for months. She understood, too, exactly why Daniel had never once raised his voice, never once needed to defend himself loudly, because the truth itself had been waiting patiently in a sealed envelope the entire time. Daniel closed the folder in front of him, looked out over the stunned auditorium, and said simply that the board would reconvene the following week to determine the company's path forward. Then he stepped down from the podium, leaving the room to sit with everything it had just witnessed. The following week, the board reconvened in a much quieter room, stripped of the spectacle that had defined the shareholder meeting. Howard Blake had already resigned in writing, along with a criminal referral prepared by the company's legal team, and the rival conglomerate that had conspired with him quietly severed all public association with Carter Holdings within 48 hours. Victoria arrived early, alone, and waited for Daniel in the boardroom rather than her own office, an unspoken acknowledgement of where authority now truly rested. When Daniel entered, Victoria stood immediately, the way everyone had learned to stand for him now, though this time it wasn't fear that moved her. It was something closer to respect, hard-won, and uncomfortable. The kind that comes only after watching someone prove themselves through action rather than title. "I assumed you'd remove me today," Victoria said quietly, before Daniel had even taken his seat. "I've already drafted my resignation letter. I understand if you'd rather bring in someone you trust." Daniel studied her for a long moment, the same steady look he'd worn in the lobby weeks earlier, though everything behind it had changed. "You made a mistake because you were arrogant," he said finally, "not because you're incapable. Those are different problems, and only one of them is worth losing a career over." Victoria's composure, so carefully maintained through every crisis of the past month, finally broke. She sat back down, tears she'd refused to shed in front of anyone else now falling freely, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to simply feel the weight of everything rather than manage it. She admitted, haltingly, that she had spent her entire career terrified of being underestimated because of her age and her gender, and that fear had calcified into a habit of judging others before they had the chance to judge her first. She had looked at Daniel in that lobby and seen a threat to the image she'd built rather than a human being standing in the rain. Daniel didn't offer easy forgiveness, but he offered something more useful, a path forward. He told her that if she wanted to remain chief executive officer, she would need to rebuild the company's culture from the ground up, starting with how every employee, from the executive floor to the loading docks, was treated by leadership. He asked her to eliminate the tiered privileges that had quietly separated senior staff from everyone else, the private elevators, the segregated dining areas, the unspoken hierarchy of whose time mattered more than whose. He wanted a company where no one could walk into that lobby again and be judged by the coat on their back. Word of the changes spread quickly through the building over the following weeks. Employees who had never once spoken directly to a senior executive began finding Victoria in break rooms and hallways, listening rather than delegating, asking questions rather than issuing directives. It was slow, and it was uncomfortable for her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but something in the building's atmosphere began to shift, department by department, floor by floor. Despite the visible progress, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she had not yet truly earned back what she'd lost, and one gray morning she walked into Daniel's office and placed a formal letter of resignation on his desk without a word. Daniel read it slowly, then set it down without signing it. "I need a chief executive who knows how to correct her mistakes," he said. "More than I need one who's never made any." Victoria stared at him, unable to speak for a moment, the resignation letter sitting untouched between them, like a door he had just quietly closed. She had expected consequences. She had expected, on some level, to be punished for who she had been in that lobby. What she hadn't expected was to be given the far harder task of proving, day after day, that she could become someone different. Over the following months, Daniel and Victoria worked side by side rebuilding what Howard had nearly destroyed, restructuring departments, renegotiating contracts that had been quietly designed to bleed the company dry, and slowly restoring the trust of investors who had watched the scandal unfold from a distance. Daniel brought a patience to the work that Victoria had never encountered in the corporate world, a willingness to sit with a problem rather than rush toward the nearest visible solution. And she found herself, almost without noticing, adjusting her own instincts to match his. Employees who had once feared Victoria's sharp efficiency began instead to respect her, not because her standards had lowered, but because they now saw those standards applied to herself as thoroughly as to everyone around her. There were long evenings that stretched into night. Spreadsheets spread across the boardroom table. Takeout containers pushed aside to make room for revenue projections, and in those quiet hours, Victoria began to see the man behind the trust fund, the one who still remembered every employee's name after meeting them only once, who insisted on carrying his own coffee rather than asking an assistant to fetch it, who spoke about his late wife only rarely, and always with a tenderness that told her more than any explanation could. She began to understand that the plain coat had never been a costume or a disguise, but simply the truest expression of a man who had already learned, long before she had, that worth was never something a person could wear on the outside. Somewhere in the long hours of strategy sessions and late dinners over spreadsheets, something quieter began growing between them. Something neither one acknowledged aloud for a long while. It wasn't built on the dynamics of power that had once defined their relationship, the CEO and the shareholder, the judged and the judge. It was built instead on the accumulated weight of small moments. Daniel staying late to help her prepare for a difficult investor call, Victoria noticing the way he still took the subway to work every morning despite owning more than half the company. Both of them slowly learning that the person across the table had far more depth than either had first assumed. Neither spoke of it directly. Both felt it settling into place regardless. Then, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, Victoria noticed something strange in Daniel's calendar. A meeting had been scheduled with the board for the following week, listed simply as transition of authority, with no further explanation attached. She asked Marcus about it directly, and the lawyer, uncharacteristically evasive, told her only that Daniel had asked him to prepare the paperwork weeks earlier, and had said very little about his reasoning. Victoria found Daniel that evening in his office, the city lights beginning to glow through the rain-streaked windows behind him, and asked him plainly what the meeting meant. "I never wanted to run this company," Daniel said quietly, looking not at her but out at the skyline his grandfather had once dreamed of conquering. "I only wanted to make sure it landed in the right hands before I stepped back. I think it finally has." Victoria felt something tighten in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet, something that went beyond professional concern. She realized, standing there in the doorway, that she had grown used to his presence in ways she hadn't fully admitted to herself, that the building somehow felt different when he wasn't in it, steadier, though she couldn't have explained why a man who spoke so little and demanded so little had come to feel so necessary. The transition meeting Daniel had scheduled was postponed twice before Victoria finally understood why. He was waiting, quietly, to see whether she would ask him to stay, or whether she would let him walk away the way he had planned to from the very beginning. She found him on a rainy Saturday morning, not in the office but in the same small coffee shop 2 blocks from Carter Holdings, where he had once sat reading his grandfather's letter while the board waited upstairs, unaware of who they were waiting for. He was seated in the same corner booth, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him. When Victoria slid into the seat across from him, without asking permission, rain still clinging to her shoulders in a way that mirrored, almost exactly, the way he had looked the first day they'd met. "The first day I saw you," Victoria said, folding her hands on the table, "all I saw was an old coat. It took me months to see the person wearing it." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something softening behind his usually guarded expression, and set his coffee down. "And what do you see now?" he asked. "Someone who never needed the company's power to know his own worth," Victoria said. "Which is more than I can say for myself, most days." Daniel allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine one Victoria had seen from him since the day they met. And something in his posture eased, as though he had been carrying a decision for weeks and had finally set it down. "I'll stay," he said, "on a few conditions." Victoria leaned forward, waiting. "You remain Chief Executive Officer," Daniel said. "Every employee in that building, from the executive floor to the loading dock, gets treated with the same respect, regardless of title. And nobody, ever again, gets judged in that lobby by the coat on their back." Victoria reached across the table and, for the first time since they had met, took his hand, not as a gesture of business but simply as one person reaching for another. A year passed, and Carter Holdings emerged from its crisis stronger than it had been in over a decade. Its culture cited in business publications as a rare example of a corporation rebuilding itself, not through cost-cutting or aggressive expansion but through the deliberate, patient work of treating people well. Employee retention climbed. Investor confidence returned steadily, then surged. The tiered privileges that had once separated executives from everyone else were gone entirely, replaced by a single shared lobby, a single shared elevator, a single shared standard of respect that applied to every person who walked through the doors each morning. Even Richard Langford, now retired from his honorary chairmanship, visited the building occasionally, no longer as a man carrying secrets, but as a grandfather figure to employees who had never known the company any other way. And he often told visitors, with a quiet pride that had taken him decades to earn, that the best decision his old friend ever made was choosing a grandson who didn't want the throne at all. Victoria and Daniel, having spent that year rebuilding the company together and slowly rebuilding themselves alongside it, allowed their relationship to become public, only once they were certain it was built on something sturdier than the crisis that had first thrown them together. They chose, fittingly, to announce it not through any formal statement, but simply by walking into the company's anniversary celebration together, hand in hand, in the very lobby where Victoria had once told Daniel to find the shelter 2 blocks away. The lobby that evening was filled with employees from every level of the company, catering staff and senior directors standing shoulder to shoulder for the first time in the building's history, sharing the same room without the invisible lines that had once divided them. String lights had been hung along the marble columns, and somewhere near the entrance, a small band played quietly, and for once the vast cold space felt less like a monument to wealth and more like something closer to a home. Old photographs of the founder lined one wall, black and white images of a young immigrant who had once carried textile samples door to door before any of the glass and marble had existed at all. Victoria stood before the gathered crowd and, without prompting, told the story of the day she had mistaken the most important man in the company for a beggar, told it not to excuse herself, but to remind everyone listening exactly how easily judgment can blind a person to the truth standing right in front of them. Her voice caught once, briefly, as she described the sound of her own laughter echoing through that same lobby months earlier, and how differently she heard that memory now. Daniel said nothing during her speech, simply stood beside her and, when she finished, reached over and took her hand in his, the same quiet gesture he had offered in the coffee shop months earlier, the same simple faith that some things speak louder without a single word attached to them. Applause rose slowly through the room, warm and unhurried, the kind that comes not from obligation but from genuine feeling, and somewhere near the back, a young employee who had once been dismissed in that very lobby, wiped his eyes and smiled. True power, the evening seemed to whisper to everyone gathered in that lobby, was never about making other people lower their heads. It lived instead in the choice to treat a stranger in a worn coat exactly as one would treat a king. Because sometimes the two are the very same man, and because the richest person in any room is often the one who has learned to need the least from it. Respect, in the end, was worth more than any fortune Carter Holdings had ever built, and it was the one inheritance that no boardroom, no scandal, and no storm could ever take away. Years later, new employees walking into that same lobby on their first day would sometimes hear the story secondhand, passed along in break rooms and elevator rides, embellished slightly with each retelling, but always keeping its essential shape: a man in a plain gray coat, a CEO who judged too quickly, and a lesson neither one ever forgot. Few of them ever guessed that the quiet man occasionally seen taking the subway to work, coffee in hand, coat still a little worn at the cuffs, was the very same man from the story, still choosing, every single morning, to walk through the front door like anyone else.